So, just wanted to highlight that unacceptable workplace behaviour can happen in any industry. And, we do hear a lot of stories in the media, some of which relate to the entertainment industry. I think we can thank Harvey Weinstein for bringing a lot of these issues into our consciousness in the entertainment industry. And then there also have been some media reports more locally as well. It's been happening in politics. So for Victorians, you might know about Robert Doyle. He was a mayor of a city council down here, and federally there've been some recent cases. In sport, we've had that horrible incident in the States with the gymnastics doctor. I put the photo of Adam Goodes in there, the AFL player, more so as to highlight that, he was more of a victim of some of these unacceptable behaviours while he was at work. But if you read media and, these issues can happen across any sphere, whether it be in academia, the surgical, medicine and the surgeons, in law firms and hospitality, it can be in banking and finance, you name it, it probably exists. So it's, whilst we may feel like there is, that the entertainment industry is, if there's a lot of focus on our industry, it's not something that is unique to us. So when we talk about unacceptable workplace behaviour, what is it that we're really talking about? So I'm going to run through a couple of these topics. So the first is discrimination. And discrimination is treating someone unfavourably because of a personal characteristic protected by law. And there are a range of different types of personal characteristics. And there's a whole raft of those on the slide there. And so an example of discrimination would be something like refusing to hire someone who's qualified in that role because they are too young or too old. Harassment. Harassment is unwelcome and unsolicited behaviour that a reasonable person would consider to be offensive. And I think the key thing here is around understanding what would a reasonable person believe. It's also important to make the distinction that harassment is unlawful or prohibited if it relates to a personal characteristic, protected personal characteristic. So there may be instances where behaviour may be considered harassment, but it may not be unlawful. So just be careful there. And even though the behaviour, the harassing behaviour may not be unlawful, it doesn't mean that it's right. You still need to, I think, address those issues if it's happening in the workplace. So an example of harassment may be, you might tell offensive jokes, or you exclude someone in the workplace because they have, have a religious affiliation, those sorts of things. So what's sexual harassment? That's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, again, that a reasonable person, and I think that's a really important concept, a reasonable person would be offended or humiliated by. This area, I think for a lot of these sorts of behaviours, sometimes it's not black and white, and there can be varying interpretations of what all this means. I think with the definition of sexual harassment, where we talk about unwelcome conduct, it goes to say that there may be times where it is welcome. Oh, sorry, that didn't work out. So where behaviour is consensual, invited, mutual and reciprocated, then that's not considered sexual harassment. Now these dot points, so if an incident is a one-off incident, you did not mean to offend someone, there may be instances where the behaviour, one person thinks they are offended by it but others don't, or there has been previous workplace practices that have been accepted. These instances actually may constitute sexual harassment. So again, think about the definition. What would a reasonable person think in that instance. And if a reasonable person would be offended, humiliated or intimidated in those sort of dot point scenarios, then it may be, some of those instances may be sexual harassment. So I think that's something really to keep in mind. What's bullying? Bullying is, it's like you need to understand that it has to be repeated behaviour, and unreasonable behaviour that creates a risk of health and safety. One of the questions that I've had in the past is, I think people, when they read the code, they get a bit confused, because in one section they read about if it's a one-off incident, then it's then it can be harassment, but then they read the definition on bullying, but we talk about repeated. So I think they're two very distinct concepts, and the definition of bullying means that it has to be repeated and it has to create a risk to health and safety. So here, if we have instance of single incident inappropriate behaviour, reasonable management action undertaken in a reasonable manner, and differences of opinion, these situations do not constitute bullying. So reasonable management action undertaken in a reasonable manner, like that may be a manager providing feedback to a staff member on the quality of their work, and as long as that feedback is provided in a reasonable way, then that would not constitute bullying. But I guess if the other side of that is if the manager was providing that feedback in an aggressive tone, potentially aggressive tone, and repeatedly providing the feedback in a aggressive tone, then that may then stray into a bullying situation. Differences of opinions, interesting one, in a sense that I think when we work in workplaces, we all may have different opinions on how things should be done, or how a particular role should be performed on stage, and so in those situations, as long as the people act reasonably and respectfully, then that would not constitute bullying. And again, I think the key thing to note is differences of opinion may not necessarily create a risk to health and safety. So again, they're the sorts of tests to think about when you're trying to decide if a behaviour is inappropriate or is construed as bullying. Victimisation. So if someone lodges a complaint, or if someone is assisting someone else to lodge a complaint, or if someone refuses to do something because they believe the behaviour is unlawful or inappropriate, you can't penalise or treat someone unfavourably for doing so, and that's called victimisation. I think an interesting thing to note on this concept, because it was something that struck me, was, well, if you are alleged to have to be an offender, like let's say you're an offender, and others in the workplace treat the offender in a inappropriate way, would that be considered victimisation? And the lawyer said, there aren't that many protections against for, I guess, offenders, and so yeah, it's interesting to note that victimisation protections do not apply for respondents or those who have allegedly demonstrated inappropriate behaviour. So in the law, employers have to provide a safe workplace. And so what is it that they need to do? Like, the first key principle is around that you need to take all reasonable steps to prevent that behaviour from occurring in the workplace. And should some incidents occur, then you need to respond appropriately to resolve those incidents. Again, and all reasonable steps is a concept that I will talk about a little bit later. But again, that's the principle of what employers need to do. And the key reason why it's important for employers to act in these situations and to provide a safe and respectful workplace is because employers can be held vicariously liable for the actions of their workers. Individuals can be held vicariously liable for their own individual actions, but employers who provide a workplace they can also be wrapped up in that. And it's also important to be aware that the conduct and actions of workers encompass when workers are at work, during work-related travel, i.e., if you're on a tour or travelling from, one city to another for a work reason, at work-related events, which may be an opening night or some industry events, and any place outside of the work where there is a connection to the workplace. That particular dot point, I've had a lot of questions about that, like in the sense of what is a connection to the workplace? We can't possibly be keeping an eye on every single thing that our workers, are doing at all times. And I guess that's a concept that's in law, and it's very hard to define. And so it's unfortunately, whilst I would have loved to have provided more guidance in the code about what that means, I think it's a hard one to do because there are so many different contexts in which that could occur. But speaking to another lawyer about this, like her example is around, well, if two workers were out having a drink and one of the workers said something to the other worker and it really affected their mental health, but then they had to go back into the workplace and work together, then there is still, even though the incident may have happened outside of work, it can have a flow-on impact into the workplace. And so, again, this is one of those sort of difficult areas of trying to be prescriptive what to do, but I think you just keep in mind that principle of you can be liable for the actions of your workers when there is a connection to the workplace. And again, social media, email and text messages is also, that digital world is another area to think about as well. It's one of those things, don't want to scare people but again, it's thinking about how can you create a workplace that everyone is respected and feels safe and enjoys coming to work. So in the previous slide, I introduced the concept of what does all reasonable steps, what does that mean for an employer? And the thing is, there is no one-size-fits-all response to this. There are organisations of varying sizes, organisations who are much more resourced than others, who have, a full-time HR department or HR manager versus those who, companies who their general manager may be the Jill or Jack of all trades. So it's, again, the concept of all reasonable steps is very hard to define and be prescriptive about. But, there are certain, I guess, things that they're taking into account. So, I guess the obligations for a smaller organisation and taking into account their size and resources, what might be reasonable for that smaller organisation the same things may not apply for a larger one. But I guess when we look at case law and when I've looked at some of the literature talking about what, commonalities of what all reasonable steps looks like, it's about ensuring that your workplace has a policy to deal with these issues of workplace discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment and bullying. Ensuring that you have a complaints handling procedure, like, what steps you will take, documented on how you will manage and deal with complaints should they arise. And then importantly, having these documents is one thing, but implementing them, I think, is another thing. So, and there may be many different ways depending on what works best for your organisation, how you might implement those. So, is it that you provide training to your workers, and training could be face-to-face versus online? Is it that you regularly talk about the issues? Is it that you make sure that your workers are aware of these policies when they're first employed with the organisation? Do you remind performers and crew at the start of a rehearsal what the key elements of what that in your policy are and what these concepts are? There are, I guess, lots of different ways that you may choose to implement, and you might do things on varying levels. So you might do things on an annual basis or as as appropriate. But there are many ways, I think, that you can implement your policies and procedures. And I think, again, the key point is around, I think when issues come to the fore, it's often, it's probably a worst case scenario. And if the workplace culture is already one that people feel safe and respected, then hopefully, nothing serious occurs. This is an overview of the resources that LPA has produced and that are available on our website. So we start off with the Code of Practice, which is really the overarching document to help people understand what their, particularly employers, what their obligations are. There is, I guess, much more detail. I've been very light touch today, but there's much more detail in the code about ways to handle things and issues to consider. Based on, for example, with this final code, and that's what's different to the draft code that were released earlier in the year, we've included some guidance around how to deal with issues relating to historical matters. So an example of that would be, just say you have a worker and you hear a rumour that they were, they had demonstrated inappropriate conduct at a former workplace, and then you find out this information. What would you do in that circumstance? We also provide guidance on, in the performing arts world, it's very common for many different organisations to work together. So you might have a venue, production company, working at a venue, or you might have different creatives working together in a team to develop a show. So there are lots of different people from different organisations working together. So what do you need to do in those circumstances when there are complaints raised against someone from one organisation, a different organisation who you're not, who's not one of your employees, and then there are a raft of template and example policies. So in the previous slide, I've indicated that some of the case law suggests that to demonstrate all reasonable steps, you have to have a policy, you have to have a complaint procedure. So we've developed example policies and procedures for people to use if that would be helpful for them. Clearly, there might be many organisations out there who already have these policies and procedures in place, so it may not be needed. But if you're wanting to look at a starting point, then we've provided some examples. In case it might be useful, we provided complaint forms, so that helps a complainant document the issues that they would like to raise. And again, this also might be useful having a code of conduct to provide to workers. So the code of conduct is in a way an abridged version of the policy. It's 2 pages, so it's hopefully not too onerous for people to read, to understand what you expect to be appropriate conduct within your workplace. I might add here, with the templates that we've developed, coming out of the feedback that we received, we've tried to provide more detail in the complaint handling and investigation procedure. We receive feedback to say we'd like more information about handling informal complaints, and that was quite an interesting one, in the sense that informal complaints generally, I think how we write it up is that you would usually use that particular process to deal with issues that are of a less serious nature, and I think it's very hard to be prescriptive with certain things, because each incident, there are so many different permutations of what a complaint might be. So as much as I can understand why people would like a lot more guidance, I think you need to find a way of dealing with some of those things that suit that particular incident, and then also suit the way the individuals involved. So hopefully there's a bit more guidance there in that procedure that it will assist people. And then and lastly, we've provided a couple of checklists. So, that might be a way for you to just quickly check off, oh, I wonder if our current policies and procedures address these principles or key points. So that's a really quick snapshot of the code and our resources, and that's just some contact information should you wish to get in touch with any questions. So that was super quick and super high level, so happy to take any questions from those on the webinar.
Thank you, Kim. That was really detailed and it's great. I have a question.
Sure.
A lot of the complaints that we've seen publicised put the complainant in a very difficult position sometimes. There was someone, for example, who complained in Western Australia of some behaviour by Barnaby Joyce. She wanted it kept private. It wasn't kept private, and that caused her enormous difficulty. What protections are there for people who find themselves complaining?
That's a really good question, and that's actually one of the areas that we, based on feedback through the consultation, that we also have provided a bit more guidance on in the revised and final documents. That you can't always, the complainant can't always be left unnamed. So depending on the nature of the complaint, and especially, so I'll take it more of a worst case scenario. So if a complaint escalates to a formal process, then the complainant cannot be remain anonymous, because the respondent has rights to natural justice, and they have the rights to understand who's made the complaint and the nature of the allegation. So in those more like really serious cases, it's not possible. But if we're dealing with, I guess, less serious cases, there may be different ways to handle it that the person, the complainant, can remain unnamed. So if we have a hypothetical example of Kim, I come to you, John, and I make a complaint about Bob in the office, and I say, I'll say he made a sarcastic comment or a joke and I didn't like it. You might, John, take action to say, I might maybe have a talk to the team and remind them about appropriate workplace conduct, that sarcasm and the jokes of these nature are inappropriate, and reminding about what is appropriate behaviour. And that's one way to deal with a circumstance where you've kept the complainant, me, confidential, or you haven't named it, but you have found a way to address the issue by reminding people what is appropriate conduct. So I think that anonymity one is hard to. Sometimes I think complainants need to be aware that it's not always possible that they remain anonymous. Again, it depends on the nature of the complaint, but it's not always possible that they can remain anonymous.
Yeah, thank you. There are no open questions that I'm aware of. If people would like to type in a question now, you're very welcome to do so. In the meantime, I might let everyone know what we plan to do with this. We really appreciated LPA's leadership here. Not just doing something about the issue, but doing something really constructive, explaining the implications for organisations, for all of us, really, and then some practical steps that we can take. Really appreciate that. We have had a very live discussion about this across the Regional Arts Network. Each of the peak state organisations has been involved in those conversations. Some have already got these policies in place in their organisations. We are taking the templates from your documents, and at the next board meeting they'll be addressed. So that very shortly, each of the organisations we deal with will have policies in place, and then the next step would be to further that by expecting that funding applicants to the Regional Arts Fund would have these policies in place too. And that will take some time to put into place, but we have a time frame of about a year where we would expect that to be done. I do have a couple of questions now, Kim. Yes, the slideshow will be available, will it, Kim? Are you able to?
Yeah, I'm happy to send it to you, John, and you can share it.
Michael's got a question. I've heard of instances where sexual harassment has been used as a tool for revenge against an employer. Is that common?
Ooh. That I don't know the answer to that question, in the sense that I personally don't deal with complaints. So yes, whilst LPA is a membership organisation, we have a workplace relations team who may deal with those issues. But
Kim, I noticed in the templates that we've used, there is something about vexatious complaints.
That's right.
Frivolous complaints.
That's right. So that would be, that would be an example of inappropriate behaviour within a workplace should someone go down that path. But if I recall correctly, some of the conversations that I've had with our lawyer, it's around, even if you might suspect it may be a vexatious and malicious complaint, you still need to treat that complaint seriously and go through the due process in order to come to that conclusion. So I think you need to be careful about how quickly you come to that decision if it is a complaint based on malicious grounds or for revenge. So I think in those sorts of tricky instances, look to your process. Hopefully you have a good process in place, follow it so that you can say that you have followed due process, and then come to your conclusion. And sometimes, and I'm sure if anyone had to come across these sorts of issues, you would, try to get advice from a range of different experts in the area, and I'm sure that's not a fun one to have to deal with. But yes, just I think be careful and follow your process, because I think disregarding it very early on may cause more problems, risks causing more problems. So yeah.
And I think in the policies that you promote, the consequences of a vexatious complaint are quite severe, including dismissal.
Yeah.
And people should be made aware of that, I think.
Yeah.
Michael also follows up and says settlement is often easier than defence. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, yeah. Again, I don't know. I think that's one of those big strategic questions for an organisation. Is it what's your risk appetite? Like how and what do you want to do? And I mean, these are big questions that it's so hard to answer. Does it set for me it'd be like, does it set a precedence? Do you have the resources to be able to handle sorts of things? I said, I don't know. I think every organisation would make tough calls on whether to settle or not.
Okay. Look, we might draw it. We've dealt with the questions that have arisen, and I'm just checking the last chat thing to see that there's nothing extra there. Kim, I really want to thank you for taking the time and going through this in such a detailed manner. There's much that we can learn from the work that you've done, and your time has been greatly appreciated today, and I thank you. And
Thanks, John.
With that, we'll say goodbye and end the meeting, and the recording will be available on our website. Thank you.